want to thank all of those firms for all of their support. As you probably know, we have been self-funding this Proudly Resilient series, and we're excited that we're able to do that, and it is because of all the support of all of these firms. So with that, let's dive in. I want to first thank Jim for joining us and say welcome. Glad to have you here.
Nice to be here, Todd. Thank you.
And what I'd really love to start with is your background. With each of these conversations, it's always important to me, and I think our leaders around the world, to understand what makes you tick as a leader, understanding your journey as an out gay leader, and how that has impacted your leadership style, and ultimately we'll talk about how you're navigating the environment today. So what I'd love to do is let's just start at the beginning. Give us a little bit of background, growing up in the Midwest, growing up, coming out, knowing you were gay, and let's start there, and then we can get into the business space.
I grew up outside of Kansas City, Missouri, a small town, about 2,800 people. Farming town. I grew up on a cattle farm. My parents actually still live there, and they're both still alive, so knock on wood, everything's good. And I went to University of Missouri, got a mechanical engineering degree, and went to work for DOW a couple of weeks out of college, and have been with DOW for now 36 years, going on 37, and have really enjoyed it. Was able during my career to spend time in a lot of different places. Atlanta for about 5 years, 11 years in Asia, Hong Kong, Sydney, Australia, which is not Asia, I know, but we kind of consider that part of the whole grand scheme of things there.
Great place to be.
Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur. And then the rest of the time here in Midland, Michigan, where I live now. I would say two things about my, childhood. Growing up was a big sports family. My dad was a basketball coach. In those days, if you were a coach, you coached every sport. If you were in a small town, you coached every sport that there was under the sun, boys
Sure.
and girls, and so he did all that. But my parents were both teachers, and so I grew up in that type of a family. And, I would say two things about coming out. I would say I first easily, I knew in high school, college that I was gay. I would say I didn't come out until I got my first job in DOW. Came out to my roommate in Atlanta, who also happened to be gay, and a good friend of some of the people that are listening in today. And but then I kept that quiet to myself for most of my career, and you have to remember, I was born in 1961. I graduated from college in 83.
Right.
And during that time period, a kind of way to live your life in the Midwest was keep that separate from your professional life. And so I kind of grew up in the era that brought you great policies like don't ask, don't tell. I kind of joke about that sometimes. We came up with some really great forward policies like that.
Yeah.
And so I could compartmentalize personal life from work life for quite a while. And when you live in a big city like Atlanta, that's fairly easy to do. When you're in big cities, like I mentioned, in Asia, fairly easy to do because you have some anonymity. When you're back in a small town like Midland, Michigan, 40,000 people where everybody knows what you're doing. And by the way, people sometimes are like, how do you deal with being in Midland, Michigan? Look, if you live in a town of 2,800 people, people know everything that you're doing. In 40,000 people, you actually have a little bit of anonymity, right. But in 2,800 people, you got none.
Right.
They not only know what you're doing, but they've talked to your parents about what you're doing before you get home. So
exactly, it's all happened before you even.
That's the world, right?
Yeah.
So,
I'm curious though, before you go on there, Jim. So you the first person you came out to was your roommate in Atlanta, and it turns out he was gay as well. Did you know that he was gay when you decided to live together? And was that like a safety thing, or like?
Did not. Had no idea. Neither one of us. Yeah, that's another interesting story. I I had been, living my life, doing my thing, and we were both in sales, so we both traveled a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And we were only at home on the weekends, pretty much. And so it was on I can't remember if it was a Saturday or Sunday. I was like, I'd been seeing somebody, and I was like, I'm going to have to write a note. I got to make sure Ray knows this, and I got to write a note and do all this. So I laid it all out in this letter. I left it on the kitchen table, and I went out for the day. And when I got back, we had a big discussion, and, it was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Neither one of us had any idea. Still great friends to this day. And so that, that really was the first experience with me. But in a corporate setting, you were never really sure whether you were safe to come out or not. And you certainly, in the 80s, with all the things that were happening, while it was becoming more popular to talk about it, at the same time there were stigmas.
Of course. You could lose
as soon as you came out, everybody, would think you had HIV, and all of that would come out, and you had no protections at all from an employment standpoint. And so everybody was very cautious. And so I pretty much stayed in the closet until, I had moved back to the United States in 2006 from Malaysia. And I had, had really some health problems in late 2008 through, I would say, 2011 were pretty tough years for me. I had stage 4 cancer. And going through all that, it caused me to do a lot of reflection. And I said to myself, look, there's some things that I can change in my life and some stress that I can eliminate. And one of them at the top of the list was at work, just to be out. The second thing that was happening at work was I was running the largest business in DOW, and I was in line to be chief operating officer, which would have put me in a line to become CEO. And it was at a time where you'll remember there were some outings that were taking place. There were some high-profile people that were being outed publicly. Right. And I said to myself, look, I need to remove this stress. I need to be out. I don't need to hide this. Mm-hmm. I want to manage the story. I don't want somebody to out me. I would like to tell the story myself. And I think we can do it in a way that's very positive, not just for me, but also for people at work. So imagine if you're a young gay person working for DOW, and you probably have a suspicion that a guy that's a COO is gay, but not out. What kind of message does that send to you? It's like, he's gay and he's not out, so, maybe I better stay in the closet and just not deal with it. So at the time I reached out to, and Louis was part of the group, Louis Vega was part of the group, Denise Hannigan, there were a group of leaders in our GLAD organization I reached out to. Sarah Kate Ellis at GLAD, yourself. We had a lot of discussions about, if you're going to do this, how do you do it? How do you plan to do it? Beth Brooke at EY, her experience. How do you plan to do it? And we laid out a game plan to do it. And I talked to my boss, Andrew Livers, at the time, and he was a big supporter. And I said, look, the thing I'm concerned about is, do I have the air cover that I need? And he said, look, go sit down with all the DOW board members. Go sit down with each one of them. I want you to do it anyway, as we're talking about this COO role. But one by one, you should go down and talk with them about yourself, talk about them about your view of the company, and talk to them about this issue. And to a person, they were all like, we support you. This is absolutely the right thing to do. We're proud of you. Get on with it, and don't worry a bit about what happens, because we're supporters. And so we set it up to be a big coming out. It was coming out day, 6 2014, I guess.
Yep.
And Lewis was on the stage with me, Howard Ungerleider, who was my CFO, who was the chair or the executive sponsor for GLAAD, which was our gay and lesbian organization.
Yep.
And they did like a fireside chat, and I came out to the group, 53,000 employees. I don't know if that was how many was online, standing room only in Midland, Michigan. Emotional, but one of the most positive experiences ever. And really, I think, changed the whole conversation at DOW, because it was okay to talk about it, right? And not that it wasn't okay before. You know, GLAAD had been in existence at that time for 14, almost 15 years. And so there was a lot of support inside the company, but it went to a different level. Mm-hmm. And the way I would say it is, we could have courageous conversations in a different way than we had before then. And I think that has helped us, and I think it's helping us right now to be able to deal with the issues that we're dealing with on racial inequality.
Right.
And look, an awful lot of our learnings from GLAAD and the work that we've done from an advocacy standpoint and building community standpoint are big work that is helping us help the Black community right now, and the Latin community too.
So Jim, I want to go back on a couple of things, because you sort of gloss over, you just chatted with the CEO about coming out, and then you just happen to have one-on-one meetings with every single member of the DOW board, and it all went perfectly well and was amazing. That is not that's a unique experience. That is not something that happens in every company. And one of the things I want us to get into a little bit is the culture of DOW, because I'm always blown away every time I hear one of your stories about advocacy and the culture that you guys have created. I'd love maybe just take a step back as you were thinking about even talking to Andrew. You know, what was that conversation like? And what do you think? Because I think, as we've talked in the past, the stereotype of a company like DOW is that it's Midwestern, and the type of work that you do in the business that you're in stereotypically would not be gay friendly, right? But has been massively. And so what do you attribute that to? And talk to me a little bit about that conversation with Andrew and what's kind of led up to that.
Yeah, I would go back to culture of DOW, and I think the culture of DOW goes back to when I joined the company. 37 years ago. It was January of '84. When I joined, one of the reasons that I joined was the camaraderie and the collegial nature of the people that I dealt with, all good people. I never, growing up in Missouri, I'd actually had never been to Michigan, flew up here for an interview, and I'd interviewed several other companies and ended up meeting a couple of DOW employees on the plane. So they were travel partners on the way up and different ones on the way back. And had a lot of discussions with them. Very open door policy inside DOW. You could talk to your boss's boss. You could talk to anybody in the company without fear of retribution. And back in those days, that was kind of an unusual circumstance. It was very candid and very open. I would not say in those days that it was the most open, but remember, when I was young in DOW, Frank Popoff was the chairman and CEO, and as he reminds me, he appointed Alan Gilmore to the DOW board. Alan Gilmore was the CFO at Ford and was openly gay, and Frank appointed him to be on the board after Alan had come out. And oh gosh, what year was it? It was in the 90s.
90s?
And Frank talked to me, after I came out. Frank still lives here in Midland. Frank reached out to me and talked to me about that. And he said, good for you. And he reminded me of the story, and he walked me through the story. And he said, I was concerned about that when I brought Alan on, but he said, actually, it was no problem. And so, the thing I would say to that about the culture, now I'm not going to sit here and I'm going to tell you the culture at DOW is perfect. Like, we're dealing with things right now on racial injustice, and we've got pockets inside the company that I know have had issues. And I would tell you that I've got LGBT employees inside the company that would raise their hand and say, it hadn't hadn't been a bed of roses for me navigating through this. You know, we're a microcosm of society. So we're going to have to deal with the same things that everybody deals with. I was fortunate to have good bosses through my career at Dow. And I was fortunate when I decided it was time to come out to have Andrew as my boss. And he had worked through all this. So he had no fears about this. And I think coming out, you know, I've said this to you before, if there's one thing that people do that will be one of the most positive things they do for themselves in their life, and one of the most positive things that they can do to change the environment, it's come out. Yeah. It has been one of the things that has increased acceptance and awareness of us since the Stonewall riots years ago. It's been the shift. We would not have the ability to get married in this country. Without it, you wouldn't have the public opinion that we have. We wouldn't have had the ruling at the Supreme Court that we had this week. I mean, how many things have been affected by that? So there's one simple thing that you could do. Obviously, plan it out. Be safe about it. Make sure you're protecting yourself. Mm-hmm. But coming out is a big one. And I don't know that it was, you know, a factor in me getting cancer. Who knows that? I don't know that we'll ever determine that. But I can tell you what, I think it is a factor in me being here today and being as healthy as I am for all the things that I went through, because I eliminated that. And one thing that everybody has to get over, and sometimes you have to do it every day, is some innate fear you have about something that's going to happen to you, because either you come out or you address an injustice that you've seen, or you take a stand. You're always overcoming some amount of fear. And fear, if it's protecting you, is a good thing. But in general, I think you've got to get beyond that. And you've got to find the courage to move to that next spot. And in my experience, whether it's coming out or anything else, once you get the courage to move to that next spot, you always look back and say, that was the best thing I ever did.
Well, so one, thank you for sharing that, because I agree with you. I think the fear that people have holds them back from a number of things, right? It's not just coming out, but it is speaking up or taking that risk in their career. And, you know, one of the things that I've experienced working with so many gay leaders around the world is also the level of empathy that we as gay people have as leaders, right? Because I would imagine coming up and being in the closet, you know, you had to code switch and be able to make people around you comfortable and navigate situations. And that gives you as a leader a certain level of empathy that not every leader has. Have you reflected on that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I mean, I certainly don't want to say that, you know, my experiences are any worse than anyone else's, but, you know, I've grown up, you know, when I was in Atlanta and we used to go out with friends, sometimes at night you would come out of a gay bar, and a lot of times we would walk home, and there are many times where there'd be people around trying to harass you or pick a fight, you know, or any number of things. So you kind of know, you kind of know what it's like to be harassed. You kind of know what it's like to be ridiculed. So, you know, does that equate to what's happening with the Black community? No. But could I get there in my mind? Can I get to a space where I could say, you know, damn, you know, why would anybody treat somebody else that way? And why would anybody want to live under that kind of oppression? Yeah, I could get myself to that space. And especially when you're just trying to live your life, you're trying to be happy, you're trying to be successful, you just want a chance, and you're not trying to hurt anybody. And then you have to confront all of that. And Ajay Banga, who's on our board, you talk about leaders that have an influence. We talk about this at the board level. We talked the last board meeting last week about the announcements that we made on Monday about racial injustice and the actions that we're taking. And in that discussion, Ajay was very cogent and said, it's all about human decency. And we've always said internally, when you talk about the culture of DOW, it's always about how you treat each other. You treat other people the way you want to be treated. You can call that Midwestern. It is kind of that, if you're in a small town, we just had a flood here, in the past month, affected an awful lot of people from every walk of life. And without hesitation, everybody in this town rolled up their sleeves from whatever walk of life you were in, me included, and went out and volunteered and helped people clean out houses and help people get relief. And, we were lucky nobody got killed. But there's an awful lot of people that lost their homes. And the first thing on people's mind wasn't about, race and who you are, anything else. It was, these people need help.
Right.
And we've got the wherewithal to help them. And we're lucky, with what we've got. We need to go show that gratitude and help people get back on their feet. If we do anything between COVID, the flood that we've had here, the issues of racial injustice, the issues that we deal with in our community, if we do anything out of this, we go back to what Churchill said is never waste a good crisis. And the reason you don't waste a good crisis is because that is when people's mind is in the right place to make change. A lot of times when you don't have crisis, people can't get their head in the space of making change. But when there's a crisis, people are ready for change. Don't waste it.
I love that. So let's take two of those things and chat a little bit about that. One, you mentioned Churchill, and I'm always interested in leaders that inspire you or that you've learned from along the way. And two, then let's go into this change idea. What are some of I'd love to talk through some of the changes and the opportunities that you're seeing. And part of that obviously being the racial injustice and the work that DOW is doing. But let's first start with just some of the leadership learnings, or whether it's internal to DOW or folks like Churchill. But who drives you? Who sort of helped create the leadership style that is Jim Fitterling?
Well, I think it'd be tough to start without starting with my dad, and not because Sunday's Father's Day, but just a couple of stories. And one I shared with our African-American community a few years ago growing up. So Dad was basketball coach. If you ever watched the basketball movie Hoosiers, that was kind of the story that we grew up in. Very small town. He had a good basketball team. We were on the outskirts of Kansas City, and so we played some pretty decent competition, some pretty tough competition. And when I was growing up, this would have been about 67, 69 time frame. Dad had an African-American kid that came on the team, Graylin Johnson. And Graylin was a great ball player. And we were a very small town. And Dad decided he was going to start him. And a very prominent doctor's child who was white didn't get to start because of that. And we had a lot of turmoil around home. Our house got spray painted and cars got egged and everything else because Dad decided to do this. And in the 60s, it was a time that was a lot like today. And when I look at what's happening today, I look back and I'm saying, I know we've made progress, but if I look at what's happening, it feels like it did just like it did back then. And it feels like whatever progress we made just went back to zero. But Dad persevered and kept him on the team. And that team, it wasn't the first year, but maybe the second year, went on to the state championships or state tournament. I don't remember if they made the championship or not. And, he had to endure a lot of crap for doing what he thought was the right thing and the best thing. And he gave Graylin a chance. And, I'm not sure in that time period how many other people would have done that. So Dad was always like that. We worked hard, you know. When we weren't in school, we were working or playing sports, right? But we had a pretty strong family unit and good family values, and we learned that at home. And so I think I'd have to start there. Had a real good advisor in college, and I had people along the way that gave me good coaching through college. Good advisor that had worked for Boeing helped me get into the business world. And I had a lot of good bosses along the way at Dow that really shaped my career. And lately, you know, a lot of leaders on the Dow board. I mentioned Ajay, Richard Davis from U.S. Bank, Ruth Shaw, who just retired from the board. You know, these are strong leaders, good human beings that I think really have a good moral compass. And you can have good business sense, and that's important, and you can be a subject matter expert in your field, but today you really have to have a very strong moral compass to guide you through this. And I think for me that started a long time ago.
It could not have, right? You don't just acquire a moral compass.
Yeah. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was my mom's dad died when she was 12. And at the time, my mom's mom wasn't working. She was a housewife. And the president of the local university knew her and just knew what a good lady she was. And he said, you know, I've got an opening for a house mother for one of the male dormitories, and you'd be perfect for that. Huh. So growing up, my experience was I'd go spend a weekend with her. We'd go to musical concerts. We'd go to baseball games. She was my baseball, you know, she'd take us to the Royals game. She was my ticket to go to the concert. I was a trumpet player, and Doc Severinsen was the trumpet player of all time. I can't tell you how many times we made a trip to go see Doc Severinsen or Clark Terry or Maynard Ferguson on my grandmother. And so, you know, and here she was back in those days on her own, you know, kind of single mom. So we've had those experiences in the family.
That's amazing. I play trumpet as well, so we have that in common.
Oh,
yeah.
We had to practice up.
Yeah, it's been a very long time. I definitely need to practice up.
Like riding a bike.
Is it? Oh, thank God. Okay, I think my embouchure would not be.
You might not last 5 minutes playing the trumpet, but I think it would come back pretty quickly. Your lips might wear out pretty quickly, though.
So I'd probably pass out from exhaustion or asphyxia.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so I want to go into sort of how this current moment is playing out. And you mentioned moral compass, so I want to start with that. Mm-hmm. Because I've had lots of different conversations recently, and I have this, I don't know about theory, but it appears to me that the CEOs of today have so much more responsibility in the current conversation and expectation from the American public and from the world to be leaders in a way that 15 years ago you would never have been expected. And, you know, obviously through our work, we've been focusing on the LGBT conversation, getting CEOs to speak out and use their public platform globally. But obviously everything from gun control and now to race, you know, so I want to shift into that. One, you know, I do think that the empathy that being the gay leader has provided you, I think prepares you for that, the moral compass you have and the culture of DOW. But one, how do you sort of see it broadly in terms of the trust that it seems that the public is putting in the business community and even the expectations that come with that? Because that wouldn't have been the job you signed up for necessarily 10 years ago.
No, I think in the business world for many years, capitalism was about maximization of profit. And, you know, until equal opportunity laws came in the U.S., there wasn't really much focus on diversity in the organization. So there had to be some pressure put on to make those changes. Today, I don't think you can go in the job if you have to have a good financial background. You have to be, I always say in our business, it's a technology business, so you need to be at the top of the heap on being up to speed on your technology. It's a world that is going digital so fast. If you're not a digital, if you're not a digital company, every company is a tech company. And if you don't have that in your strategy, you're going to get left behind. You'll be picked up by somebody that does. So you've got to be sharp in that area. This whole issue of human decency and how people are treated, and being open and giving people a chance, and how that affects your recruiting, how it affects your advancement, how it affects training. And then, the other thing, the other reality, before we went into this COVID situation and the economic recession that's causing, we were running pretty tight on workforce here, right? So, access to workforce meant businesses had to be doing more than just going to a college campus to hire. You had to be out in the middle schools getting kids convinced that the right thing to do was go get a technology, science, technology, engineering, math degree, work with a group like First Robotics to get them interested in that kind of work, because maybe not you're competing with, I'm competing with Amazon and Google. And if I don't go show them what they can do in a company like Dow, the math modeling and the research that we do and the process control that we do and how similar that is, they're going to have no idea, and they're going to go make a career choice, and I lose out on all that talent. So you have to deal with all of that. You have to deal with sustainability. In our business, which is an energy intensive industry, we announced in the climate goals this week that we were going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Hey, that's not a small task. And anybody that's in the industry, in fact, our university partners that we work with will tell you 2050 is a pretty stretched goal. It's going to take a lot of technology and we're going to have to sink a few long putts to get there, but we've got to be able to do it. So you have to be able to cover all that, and you're doing it in the background of a financial market and a public market where investors are changing dramatically on you. Investors in the old days used to always be concerned about your financial return. Now they're concerned about all of it. And there's not metrics for all of it, and there's not transparency on all those metrics. And so we're not only having to drive to a different level, but we're having to write the rules and put the metrics in place and make them visible. Social media has changed the game in terms of the standard that everybody's held to. It's changed the game in positive ways. It's changed the game in negative ways too. But it is here, and I don't think it's going away.
Well, and that's just, that is the definition of leadership in today. Right? You're literally setting the rules. So let's talk a little bit about the ESG strategy, and I want to sort of wrap into that, obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement and some of the diversity piece. And maybe let's actually start with that and then wrap it into the ESG piece of it. So you mentioned a couple of the different pieces that you and Dow have undertaken, not just now, right? I mean, Dow has been focused on this for a long time, which I think matters now more than ever. And the companies that have just woken up to this, I think, are going to be in a very different situation than Dow. But let's talk. How are you navigating that current challenge?
Yeah. So everything in your life touches chemistry, and we're an industry that has to deal with, not all chemistry is benign. Some of it you're dealing with hazardous materials, right? And some of the most benign, non-hazardous materials you make start out as some pretty hazardous chemical reactions. But that's the world that we live in. We're also an energy-intensive industry, and so we emit CO2 because it takes a lot of energy to produce the products that we make. So two of the biggest challenges we've got on the sustainability front are around CO2, carbon, and the climate change, and trying to get to the Paris Accord and a 1.5 degree C environment. And the second one is around plastic waste in the oceans. Mm-hmm. And the challenge, I think, for us is on the CO2 side, we're not going to be a less energy intensive company. And we're also going to, the products that we make, things like insulation for your home, this is an example of the dilemma that you have to deal with in our industry. You want to buy a Tesla because a Tesla is an environmentally friendly car. That Tesla's made up of a lot of materials that it takes a lot of energy to make. And the world is saying, we want to shut all of the people that make all the raw materials that go into that Tesla down because they're evil.
Right.
That's the world. And so, my view on this is you don't have a choice but to try to get to a carbon neutral endpoint by 2050. You probably have a lot of choices on how to get there. And some of them that exist today and some of them that are going to take a while. So let's take the ones that exist today. We look at alternative energy, wind, solar, other sources. And so we had a goal to have 750 megawatts of alternative power in our use. That's a lot of alternative energy. That puts us in the top 25 globally of all alternative energy users and the top in our industry. We're almost to that goal. We had 4 deals that were announced this week that were almost half of that goal. So we're almost to that goal quite a bit early. Do that, energy efficiency to get some reduction, and then new technologies, which may be 3 or 4 or 5 years out to kind of get the next leg of reduction. So we can identify probably 80% of how we're going to get there by 2050, and we got 20% to define. But then again, we've still got to grow the company because we're going to put 2 billion more people on the planet, and they're going to want packaged food and health and hygiene materials and transportation and all the things, housing and all the things that we make to provide that. So that's one challenge. Plastic waste in the environment is another one. If you listen to the most extreme people, they would say to you, plastics are evil. They've got to be banned. But the alternatives to plastics also consume energy and also are expensive. In some cases, they're 4 to 5 times more energy intensive than the plastics. The issue we have to tackle is the waste issue.
Right.
Plastics can be recycled and reused, but not a lot of them are today. Only about 10% of them are. So we're really trying to create a circular economy, and that includes regulation, because today, with oil price as low as it is, it's cheaper to buy virgin plastic than it is to recycle it, and it always has been. But if you want to make that happen, a regulation like an enhanced producer scheme would put a value on that recycled material that would cause capitalism to be able to work in a positive way to make it happen. So we're working on that. In addition, on the social side, we're working on both inclusion and diversity, and we start with inclusion because if you don't have the kind of a culture that brings people in, includes them in advancement opportunities, includes them in decision making, puts them on the teams that drive the strategy of the company, then you might have diversity for a while, but it won't sustain itself. You'll have numbers and then people will leave. You've got to have an environment that nurtures that and continues to build on that. So that's the driving force from that standpoint. And that starts at the board level. So if you look at all the changes we made at the board and the diversity that we have there, we're not the best in our space, but we're in the top 2 or 3 in our space in terms of board diversity. And we're very good relative, when you get outside of our industry, even we're very good relative to the S&P 500. Mm-hmm. It's at the management team level, and it's all the way down through the organization. And so we have activities at each different step along the way. ERGs are a big part of that. Our employee resource groups, there are 10 of them, have been a big part of creating that inclusive culture that we have, but also advocating, because the ERGs advocate internally for changes that need to be made, and they advocate externally for changes that need to be made. So our GLAD ERG has been one of the biggest advocates for years. We had people in DC, Louis Vega, who's listening today, I know, but Janet Boyd, others who wrote big sections of the amicus brief and different pieces of legislation that went in, who worked on ENDA, who have been big advocates for that. Those kind of contributions have come out of our ERG groups. So what happened when the racial issues started after George Floyd's death, the first two groups to reach out to our African network were GLAD and our Latin network. And in both cases, and I'm very proud of them, because in both cases, what they came back and said, we know how to address this, and advocacy has to be an important part of what you do. And let us talk about what our advocacy policies are and how we organize to help get that done. And by the way, how we use the company resources to also do that for us. We've advocated positively for positive change, but we've also advocated and pushed back on legislation that has been hurtful. And so you'll remember when the marriage ruling came down, you know, the very next thing, the dinner that we had in New York was to talk about what was going to happen in the middle of the country, because the response to the Supreme Court ruling that allowed marriage was that many states came back with religious, quote unquote, religious bills that were, going to put us back 30 years. And so, in any of these changes, it's not permanent, right? You make a step forward, you have to defend that ground, and you have to try to make another step forward. And that's where we are today. This ruling this week was great, but we have more work to do. We've got to get legislation in place at the federal and also at the state level that allows protections even beyond employment, because people can still be discriminated against from a healthcare standpoint, from a housing standpoint, adoption standpoint, we could go down the list. There's still work to do. Not that I'm not happy, but I'm just realistic.
Yep. Well, and that's two comments on that. One, that's actually our LGBT Climate Index that you helped us launch last year. Sort of itemizes those 20 different data points in the state, and only 2 of them are employment related. Everything else that we can still be discriminated against still does exist. So the things you mentioned and the Equality Act would be the way to hopefully move that along, but it's not, anytime in the Mitch McConnell future. But also the advocacy piece. Something I've always been so impressed by is, one of the stories that I've heard you tell in the past of employees hopping in a van and going to advocate in Louisiana when Bobby Jindal was going to put a bill to the floor that would have been anti-discriminatory, and it's one of the biggest employers in Louisiana. DOW employees went and, correct me if I'm wrong in my recollection of the story, but they didn't even ask you. They just knew that that was the right thing to do for DOW, and the culture of DOW supported that, and they went and advocated. And I think that speaks volumes of the culture that you guys have created, and I think probably will serve you well in this current moment as well.
Well, we have a philosophy, and we have values, and we have principles that we work towards. So we've thought about it ahead of time. It isn't like it's come up before. We know what our stand is on these kind of law. We know we're trying to push for employment non-discrimination. So we know that when something that flies directly in the face of that comes, we're not going to hesitate to get up there, on the day and say, wait a minute, time out. Whenever you got a charging elephant coming at you, the first shot kind of gets his attention, right? And so that first response is important, and you got to be able to get out there and say, time out, and that's what the team did that day. Was they heard it was going to the floor that day, and there was 11 or 12 of them got in a van and went right to the Capitol, and they were right in there. Dow was there. I think IBM was there. I can't remember who else, but we were visible and saying, this is not right. And when the bathroom bills came out in Texas, Earl Shipp, who was our Gulf Coast operations leader, wrote an op-ed that day and to explain why it wasn't right, and really started the advocacy down in Texas. Our Dow AgroSciences team in Indiana fought for years. We're working in Michigan trying to get our own civil rights law updated. It's the Elliott Larson law, which is the same vintage of the United States Civil Rights Act that we're looking at trying to update as well. So, those things were both in the 60s, and we're looking at them now and saying these need to be up to date.
So the last couple of things I want to chat about, one, and the Black Lives Matter movement in particular, in the LGBT space, I wouldn't say luckily, but there are specific laws that we are still trying to focus on. There's specific rights that we don't have. We are legally able to be discriminated against in lots of ways. And so it's an easier, in some ways, action, right? It's trying to target specific things. Racism, of course, especially systemic racism, is insidious and is much, much harder, more diffuse, and so many other places. How do you look at I guess, tackling that organizationally, and also how do we make sure that 6 months from now that this feels like a turning point? This feels like a different moment than the Rodney King. I mean, it's a litany going back years and years and years, as you noted. But this feels, right. How do we maintain the momentum so that change does actually happen?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that have to be tackled. There's certainly an education element to it, right? So, clearly what's come out of the protests that are happening is people's views of what's racial equality, what's equality and what's inequity are all over the map, right? We don't have any common definition. That makes it very tough.
Yeah.
I think what we have said is we need to get back to human decency. We're all humans. And from that standpoint, you could say really there's one race, and that's the human race. And, we need to go to that higher principle to guide us in terms of what's right. Mm-hmm. I don't think, my guidance back to the team is we're going to start inside DOW on the changes that we need to make, and we're going to leverage as much of that as we can outside. So we're going to look at advocacy, and let's look at some things internally. One of the things we talked about is putting in place a social justice council. So I would tell you today, because racism is so insidious and because it's hard to prove, there are a lot of people that feel like they've been wronged, that haven't been able, in their view, to get a fair hearing along the way. You've got to have a body that's going to handle that and going to deal with that in a transparent way and an open way. But you've also got to have some education along the way with people, leaders, on how we're going to deal with this. It isn't, I'll use an example here. If somebody comes to you and says, I think I've been threatened or I've been treated bad at work because of my race, and your boss says to you, okay, you go report that to the ethics and compliance hotline at work. That's your avenue to go take care of it. And the boss washes their hands of the whole deal, and that's their contribution to the whole thing.
Right.
That's not going to solve it.
No, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
The boss, if you're the people manager and somebody brings you that, you've got to be part of that solution. If you are going to live the culture and the corporate values, you've got to be part of that solution, helping that person get to what's right. Otherwise, the term I used was you're a yo-yo manager. You're on your own. And I think that's how the Black community feels today, is that they've, everybody thinks this has been solved, but we've been out on our own for a while. We haven't been getting much help, any help. If anything, we've been getting the reverse of that. We've been getting oppression. And so that to me is the toughest challenge, and we have to step up and tackle it. And if we can tackle it, what we've seen in DOW is if we can tackle it within DOW, we can have a positive influence in the greater community that we serve, because our people go out into the community and they're part of organizations and they provide leadership in those organizations. The other thing I would tell you is that sometimes you get out into the community and find out the community is doing it better than you are. And you've got to go out and be part of it. There's a whole lot of noise out there today between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. We were pretty clear at the end of our statement that Black Lives Matter. And probably the best simple definition I've heard of that was it was done in a military context. And, a former soldier said, look, when we're out on the battlefield and Smith goes down, we don't say all soldiers matter. We say we got to fix Smith. Smith is down, Smith is hurt. We got to get in there and fix Smith. That's what's important right now. Of course, everybody matters, but our focus right now is Smith. That's, to me, when we say Black Lives Matter, we got somebody down, and we got to help them out. And that's the focus that we've got to have as we move forward. And by the way, if we were down, that's what we want somebody to do, helping us. And I think it's back to that human decency. We're going to have to put money at it. Money is not going to solve it alone.
No.
Sometimes the money doesn't go to the right places, but money is necessary. So we've got to put some money into it. We've got to put money to education. Education always helps. Education creates more opportunities. There's a lot of the Black community that doesn't get a chance because they don't have the education. That could be skilled trades. It could be community college. It could be 4-year degree or beyond. But education has to be part of it. Some of them don't have a chance to go to high school and finish high school. How are we going to survive? We are going to get back to pre-COVID types of demand levels. And when we do, we're going to be back to shortage of workers. We need this part of the population to be an effective part of future employment, and we need them now. And so we got to make sure that not only do we help them, but it doesn't get worse for them because of what's happening with COVID. They've already been, afflicted by COVID worse than other races. We've got to make sure that it's not, too much at one time. We've got to help out.
Yeah, there are two viruses killing the Black community right now, right? Basically,
right.
Well, and I love what you're talking about with the Social Justice Council, and I think as I'm understanding it, is an opportunity for people to be heard. And one of the things that I've heard from so many leaders in the Black community is that for so many years they've been told just take it in stride. Sure, that boss was racist, but look at the long game, or don't talk about it. Don't make the white people uncomfortable. And interestingly, in the same way that gay people don't want to make straight people uncomfortable, Black people have been told don't make white people uncomfortable. But it's so much more insidious when it's focused on race, I think. And so I think you're creating that opportunity for transparency and conversation.
When you have to know the other challenging thing, we started all this with coming out and the whole coming out story. Part of the coming out story is know who your allies are and know who's in your camp, right? I mean, you do have to have a scorecard that says, this is somebody I know has got my back, and this is somebody I know doesn't, and everything in between, I'm really not too sure, right? But I gotta have strong support from the people that have my back. That makes it easier. It may be easier for you to tell that as a gay person than it is as a Black person, because racism can be so insidious. And so, that's my first advice. Allies are important, but the other thing is we got to know the score. We got to know who's got your back and who's really going to do something. Not say something, not put a document out and put some words out or make a monetary contribution, but who's actually going to do something that makes it, to take an action on your behalf that makes a difference.
And that is the definition of a true ally, someone that is going to take action. That's exactly right. And I think that will make sure that this conversation perpetuates, that if allies are taking action, then we will actually see some of this progress that we're all trying to make. Well, Jim, that's a perfect spot for us to wrap up, because I want to make sure we're being respectful of your time. We've got a lot going on.
Well, it's good to see you. It's I wish it was in person, but I think where we are, this is the right way to do it. So
I agree, but it's great to see you, and thank you for lots of things. One, for your support about leadership, for your support of me personally, and most of all for being just such a visible, amazing, inclusive leader. I think in times like this where you have Twitter storms from our commander-in-chief that are and all the negativity that the world can provide right now, it's always inspiring to get to hear from leaders like you who are fighting a good fight. And I think it does give me hope for the future that we are going to come out of this in a positive way and be better for it. No crisis.
We will. The only thing that stands between us and doing that is an unbeatable will. And you've got to have that will to drive forward. You got to keep positive, and like Churchill said, don't waste a good crisis.
With that in mind, we will not. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Jim, thank you so much, as always, for everything. And stay safe, and we'll look forward to hopefully seeing you in person in the very near future.
All right. Take care. Nice to see you, Todd.
Nice to see you too.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride to you. See ya.
Bye-bye.